Guys, I've got the data. We're going to talk about it in a few minutes, but on both Lake Mead and Powell and what's going on. But what you're looking at is a simulation, and it's basically the third tunnel or the third straw at the bottom of Lake Mead going into Vegas for its backup. It took them a long time to do it. They went in, they had some leaks, they had to back out, they had some collapses, had to back out and punt 2 or 3 different times to get it finished. Again, you're seeing they drilled through the rock. They didn't put a metal pipe in. They lined the walls with these concrete panels. And because of the high pressure and the high flow in that tunnel, people can't go in there when they have to do repairs, so they have to use underwater robots, very large ones, very strong ones. And if it's bad enough that they will repair, they will have to shut down. I think they got about 60-something pumps in the Vegas area to pull water from Mead. And so they'll have to shut that down because, again, the pressure would pull any robot or any person out of there very quickly. But the robots anchor themselves to the ground, and then if you look at those panels, they have about 2 inches of a sealer connecting them, a waterproof sealer. And any shifting, from a small quake or anything like that can shift them out a little bit, and then the robots have to be sent in. They are also sent in for just inspections. Now, I think they schedule that without problems every 1 to 3 years. And when you're in a very seismic area, it's a very good idea. We're going to dive into that and look at some of the possibilities if they have a problem that extends a minor leak, like a quake shifting one of these panels, even down to the square footage of the panel and how much cubic feet per second would be lost depending on how much it shifted, or if it actually fell out. But they've got plans for it built in. Now, looking at the 6-foot panels that again, in the illustration, guys, they have a universal tapered ring layout. I'm reading from the data about the construction. If severe seismic shifting along the local fault lines caused just one of the panels to slip out of alignment by a mere 2 inches, the rubber gasket will fail. Under the immense weight of the remaining water column, Torricelli's fluid dynamic formula dictates that water will erupt into the surrounding rock matrix at a blistering 111 feet per second through a 2-inch crack. Now, of course, that will affect, Lake Mead a little bit and things like that, but one of the big effects is the shutdown that's necessary for repairs. Now, if you look at the top layer of data in Vegas, they have underground aquifers and storage and things like that. But I looked at some information and as far as how much storage was in these deep drilled and filled aquifers and the storage tanks. And if the aquifers were full, there's a pretty good bit of time there, maybe several months before they start to suffer. But it seems that a lot of that water, as they were drilling, or not drilling, but pumping upstream for the agricultural sectors, has depleted those underwater reservoirs. If any of you guys are in the Vegas area and have details on it, let me know. But in other words, what I'm getting to is you're cutting off one supply, so they're preparing with the underground storage to replace that supply if the repairs take an extended period of time. But if the aquifers are lower, then the days of backup water will be limited. So it'll be kind of a balance, if you understand what I'm saying. They're more than likely to be able to handle it, but water's getting low throughout the area. Now, when you're dealing with a 2-inch crack at 111 feet per second, then you're looking at 424 cubic feet a second flow detection, instantly draining over 274 million gallons of water every 24 hours out of the reservoir and into the mountain. Again, your main pipeline from Mead is temporarily shut down, of course, and they rely heavily at that point on the second straw. And as we get lower, it will affect that ability. But it says a single 2-inch failure of a 6-foot edge seam would instantly swallow up to 60% of the entire intake capacity heading to the filtration stations once they start to shut down the pumps. But what would happen is Lake Mead would would continuously continue to fill the tunnel until it got either to the pumps and stopped, or it continued out the cracks as they were repairing. Anyway, we're just looking at the data and possibilities. Now, if you, again, this 2-inch failure of a 6-inch seam would instantly swallow up to 60% of entire intake capacity headed for the filtration station. So they would be able, I guess, to pump out about 40%. Then, again, I don't know how that will affect the pumps, cavitation, anything like that. But they have an automated SCADA telemetry screen at the plant. It would turn red with mass balance alarms within seconds. And then your operators, they would completely cut the power to the submersible pump banks just to isolate the breach. Guys, and it reminds me of storms that we've been through, and being without water, and a little backup water always helps during a temporary emergency, right? And looking at the possibilities, I'm not saying it's going to happen, but they planned for it. And they knew in the construction that it was a shifting rock formation, especially if you have, any type of seismic event. And I'm not sure, they may have did some seismic stress tests. But at 424 cubic feet breach, that's the 2-inch crack, it would drain 274 million gallons of water every 24 hours out of Mead into the surrounding rocks, maybe back into the aquifers. But this single 2-inch failure immediately swallows up to 60% of the entire water supply headed to Las Vegas Valley Filtration Station. Now, we're talking about the bottom third intake, right? So, again, we have these warnings, and the SCADA control screens at the treatment plant would turn red within seconds as flow meters flag a massive, unmanageable drop in reception volume. Of course they would. I don't know if you'd call it pressure drop, but it would definitely, what it would do, they would see less pressure on the turbines. You understand what I'm saying? And immediately it would switch it to a cutoff. So that backup aquifer supply in Vegas would be very important at that time. Now, if they couldn't get in there in time, or say the seismic pressure was more than just a minor shake, maybe a little heavier, and one of the long panels you're seeing dropped out, well, they cover 75 square feet. They're 6 foot wide and 12 feet what's called arc length, because they curve. And so, guys, that opens a raw geometric hole in the side of the entire tunnel. Again, going back to Torricelli's equation, under the lake's current 15-bar deep hydrostatic pressure, the water would still rush out at 111 feet per second. But where does the math change? The 75 square feet times 111 feet a second at the discharge rate is 5,160 cubic feet per second. Guys, that's more than Powell's getting in right now. Again, so just looking at the math, again, 75 square feet, 100 times 111 feet per second, with the 0.62 discharge rate, guys, is 5,160 cubic feet per second. That's more than Lake Powell is getting in right now. But it is classified as a failure because the maximum capacity of what they call the entire Saddle Island pumping station, that's where the pumps are, is only 1,390 cubic feet per second. 900 million gallons per day is what they can pump. At 5,160 cubic feet a second, structural blowout is nearly 4 times larger than the plant's maximum pumping volume. And so what would that mean? The water would bleed out, guys, into the mountain strata so violently that it would instantly reverse the flow, sucking the treatment plant's reservoirs dry and causing an immediate structural pressure drop. So it's always good to have backup water, right? In any situation, I don't care where you're at. But they're looking at it. They're making all the plans they can do. Again, the limitations are there. You have to use robots and robot cameras and things like that. But at least they have prepared for the scenario. Now, when they designed the third stall, and guys, I forgot to mention that the robots don't have to visually see a leak because they do, just like submarines, they emit a sonar through that tunnel that will detect any type of leak or any kind of pressure change. And so that's really good too. But now, listen, they do have something that has to be watched because as well as man plans things, They don't always work exactly because it's hard to factor in all the details. But what they're looking at is what's called delta migration. Now, when they built the third straw, they planned for this. It was perfect. They built it in the very center, or they drilled through the very center of the riverbed coming up. That gave them the deepest straw, right? And they put it in areas where the current was strong and would keep the sediment that builds up along the base of Hoover Dam, 100 feet or so, that would keep that moving away from the intake of the third straw. Perfect planning. Now, again, it's hard to foresee all possibilities, but there's a factor, and it's called delta migration, and it's a sediment threat. And as the levels drop at Mead or in any reservoir, then you have sediment deposited in all the arms, especially coming from upstream down. Sometimes the sediment will filter and settle down way before it gets to Hoover Dam. But it will build up along these different inlets and bays and things like that until the water drops. And then again, this delta migration begins. It says the mud is marching. Before Hoover Dam was built, the Colorado River deposited millions of tons of mud along its natural channels. As Lake Mead drops towards 1044.56, that's today, I think it's a little lower now, the shallow northern arms of the lake are drying up entirely. This is causing a flushing effect. With the lake level so low, incoming tributary flows are cutting directly through these newly exposed mud flats, physically picking up decades of old loose sediment and fine wildfire ash. Remember, we talked about by the time these wildfire debris piles get through all the other dams and down to Mead, it's basically a fine ash sediment, which has corrosive properties both physically and chemically, and they try to treat the turbines for that. But because it's fine, it's not as dangerous as larger chunks. Now, I want to say this, and it was mentioned in some of the updates, was that if you do get a good rain, a good monsoon rain that kind of floods down through Vegas and through the outlets and back into Mead, after it's been this dry, you do have a lot more particle inflow into Mead that can become a little bit of problem on the turbines themselves. But again, the mud is marching. Before Hoover Dam was built, the Colorado River deposited these debris from everywhere, from washing down the canyons, rocks, minerals, whatever. Now, the flushing effect is when the level goes so low, the incoming tributary flows are cutting directly through the newly exposed mud flats, physically picking up decades of the old loose sediment and fine wildfire ash. And where's it going, guys? The river current is carrying this heavy, suspended mud slurry right down the old river channel, the exact deep trench where the base of the third straw sits. So there could be a problem because of this delta migration on the third straw. It's good to be prepared. Vegas engineers just hired an outside firm to evaluate the third straw because the bottom of the lake is filling with mud faster than they expected. Again, the delta migration. They did not expect, even with all the work that they did, a sudden drop this much to where the mud flats really didn't get to dry out. They were just muddy and being pulled in. Now, there you're not really having a turbine on that opening, and it was covered with like a big ball, guys, a big one, before they finished to keep the water from draining through it too prematurely. They pulled that plug and it filled up. But the damage there would not be, say, as the turbine damage would be with mud or so in the Hoover Dam's hydro turbines, because it's more open. But the threat is that the migrating mud delta traveling down the old riverbed would physically bury the opening of the straw. Now Vegas is already discussing it. This is not hyperbole. They're discussing options to shorten the intake pipe or build massive undersea settling basins to filter out the muddy slurry before it destroys their drinking water pumps. And we really have two battles. Hoover Dam is fighting the vortex sand crisis that we talked about at 990 feet, while miles away the third straw is fighting an underwater landslide of traveling mud. Sometimes it kind of comes from all sides. And so if you look at it, when they designed it, guys, the opening of the third straw down in that riverbed sits at 860 feet above sea level, which is 35 feet below the dam's dead pool of 895 and sitting directly in the old deep Colorado River channel. So we have two things that the engineers are watching and trying to prepare for. Now, looking at the latest on what the Bureau of Reclamation's most recent modeling is that Lake Powell is projected to drop below the critical 3490-foot threshold as early as August 2026. That matches pretty much how we've been looking at the map with Lake Mead. Now, that's about 30 feet above where the problems began at 3526, where they're at now. If it gets down to 3490, which let's see, that would be 36 feet, you're going to drop to about 23% of the total capacity of the reservoir at that time. And again, it depends on how, if we have some late summer monsoons or whatever, but it does directly tie into how we look at the incoming versus the outcoming from both Powell and Mead. And we're going to look at Mead first. Again, these are 14 days ending yesterday on June 30th. So what we're dealing with is an inflow of 9136 coming down from Powell and an outflow of about 3,000 or so cubic feet per second, more than that to feed downstream hydropower and water needs. And the average is 9230 for 14 days. You can see how they put the pressure on Mead as we looked at the possibility of which lake would drop first. Then it seems they put a lot of pressure on Powell right now, keeping Mead up. But your average is 9230 over 14 days. And look at the outflow the average for 14 is 13,221. You see some days in here, 15.4, down to 12, down to 9. But again, your inflow is less than your outflow at Mead. And the temps, guys, we got a break of a couple of days, less than 100 at Mead. Now they're jumping back into that. So that's something to calculate into the math. Now, if we look at the average inflow coming into Mead over June 30th, again yesterday, since the dam was born, averaging each day, then we get 16,180 feet, cubic feet per second. Outflow is 15,606. That's going out of Mead. So from 16 on your average of every June to now, it is cut in half. You see that? Not quite, but 9,136 compared to 16,180. Outflow, it's 12,013 because of downstream demands. The average is 13, but the average that maintained the downstream power so well was about 15,606. So that's, if you average 13 into that over 14 days, you're losing about 2,500 or so cubic feet per second downflow. As the heat rises and the heat rises, the wind, the evaporation rate increases, that drop number may increase a little bit too. All of this is just factored into, and the engineers are watching it, to what we're seeing. We're still looking at near the end of July, early August, for both dams, Powell and Mead, to get into some cutback levels where they have to back down a little bit and try to maintain themselves. Now let's move upstream 260 miles to Lake Powell through the Grand Canyon, guys. And the numbers are similar. Lake Powell may be in a little more difficult position than Mead is at the point. The reason I say that is here in the daily change, like 0.12 is the average for the 14-day period, and that's feet per drop, 1.2, feet per day dropping. Now, you're seeing some 19s and 14s here and things like that, but just a few weeks ago, all of these numbers were plus, similar to the numbers, but they were gaining depth instead of losing it. And so we can see easily why by just looking at the 14-day inflow and outflow. It hasn't changed much, guys. We started looking at 3 to 4 days in a row as a natural trigger point for changes where changes have to be made. And the average is 5086. That's the inflow, but again, your numbers 35, 35, bouncing back a little bit from 4493. But the average, we're getting the average at 5,086 cubic feet per second. But the inflow average when you have mountain snow is 27,644. Same difference, kind of, not quite as drastic, but when you look at the outflow, they're keeping it steady. Look at that. In other words, they're releasing more than they're taking in and keeping a Mead in a little bit better shape. And they have to do that not only because to keep Mead up, but they're losing a tremendous amount of evaporation water via that 260-mile very heated canyon. But your average over 14 days of outflow is 8543. And look at your outflow averages from the beginning is 15,000. So you're about half the outflow that's normal and way below the inflow, guys, because of the El Nino effect and no snow in the mountains. So these are, again, data points that the engineers are watching, that, of course, we watch on this channel, things like that, and it's things you need to pay attention to. And for the last several videos, guys, we went to the satellites and looked at the amount of available moisture in the atmosphere to see if we're getting any breaks or changes. But what we are seeing, again, is dry conditions here. Still pushing to the right a little further, and not a lot of moisture getting in there. And so it's just one of those really hot summers. I don't know how long it will last, if we're going to get some monsoons. And again, I mentioned that if you do get some heavy rain off monsoons, they have to watch the turbines a little closer for debris intake. Looks like you're getting a lot of moisture buildup in the low pressure system here because of the heat of the El Nino. Now, it looks like we're getting rain here in southern Mississippi. We're not, but we do have a high humidity and temperature at 91% or 91 degrees Fahrenheit, 83% humidity. Guys, the heat index has dropped from 126 to now being 119. That gives you an idea of the difference between hot air and very moist air. It's a different effect, but they both can cause serious problems with your health. Definitely heat strokes, dehydration, and things like that. But again, the telemetry does not lie, so that's what we do. We look at the data. Anybody can decide for themselves how they want to handle it. But my job is to set it here, let you look at it. Now, going past that telemetry, guys, let's look at the actual physical eye from the satellite. And you can see we're kind of getting that same moisture trail here going through Texas, but this is mostly dry air, not much moisture in it. But you saw that on the first satellite feed, right? Now, but we're going to zoom into this area, and we do still have a problem with the wildfires, and they're working as hard as they can to get to them, but they're in difficult areas sometimes. Now, what we're seeing, and I've got it zoomed in right here, guys, you've got here is Arizona. You can see the Sedona fire above there. Going up into Utah, we've seen this fire burning. And over into Colorado, we see one. There's actually three here that haven't quite joined together. Check that out right there. Let me move that over a little bit. And the tenders are very dry. You got two really strong ones here. And guys, looking at New Mexico, we still have a fire right there, and it seems to be very hot. But notice that the winds have moved more northerly than they are moving to the right or to the east. And what that creates is once they'll start to get a front line controlled or something like that, and the sudden wind shift will cause a little more problems. They have to account for that. It can shift over into a different ridge or valley very quickly, burn up another 20,000 acres before you know it. Now, the moisture here, let's take a look at that. You're seeing some clouds here and a little bit of moisture here, but when you're just in these colors, as far as the moisture, a lot of that will never hit the ground. I've seen it come over us here and wishing for it, but it just didn't make it. It's so hot. But now, when you get down into West Texas, right there, very northeastern corner and section of New Mexico, going up into the Roswell area, it's a little thicker there, and it kind of spreads out. Now, if we look at Louisiana over here in southern Mississippi, This is real moisture. But in this heat, guys, we can see thunderstorms, possible violent thunderstorms, and even tornadoes. And what I think we're seeing happening, again, we're getting northern Alabama storms moving over into our state here. Louisiana's getting an impact, and Florida, you're seeing it. But we got a big high pressure dome over us too, and the moisture is being pulled around in this clockwise formation. And notice this curve right here, you get a little bit of low pressure break in that high pressure dome, and this moisture creeps in. The problem again, guys, for everyone in this area and here is to watch for more severe weather. I'm not going to go into much more detail on this, guys. I just wanted to kind of hit the highlights of it and give you an idea of how it kind of shifted, I guess, from looking at the water height to down into the very bottom of the lake at Mead, and looking at the infrastructure, the possibilities, and how the plans, or how they have planned to handle any type of emergency. Let me know in the comments, guys, what you think about it. And what I'd really like to see is, some of you may have been around when they were building this, or you may be working on some of it, and let us know what you see on the ground there. And that we would all appreciate it. I would appreciate it, and all the viewers would also. And I'll end this by quickly saying two things. First, the new algorithms are saying that you just about need to resubscribe to a channel to get the daily inputs now. I don't know if that will change. The other thing is that our Father loves you. I love you very much. And this is a heads up. Be safe. Again, thumbs up and subscribe. Thank you.